you can come here. There's a mic and everything. So now we're going to have Samuel VEISSIÈRE, who is Associate Professor at the Department of Psychology at the University of Quebec in Montreal.
Hi, it's a bit odd to be the only francophone on this panel. I'm used to interacting with these folks in English. Apologies for my anglophone French, je vais parler en français aujourd'hui. Donc oui, bonjour, merci, c'est un grand honneur.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. It's a great honor to be here. I'm an anthropologist and a researcher clinician in Montreal in a team that is specialized in social polarization and radicalization leading to violence. Among my modest contribution to the questions that we're looking at today with my anthropologist hat, I suggested that I should conceptualize ROGD as a cultural distress idiom, as a syndrome linked to culture, if you wish, based on the representation of roles of genders, which, according to me, are true for all young people. So ROGD would only be the tip of the iceberg in the general framework of loss of confidence in all forms of authority, parental, medical, etc. So I will get back to this in a minute. I was invited here today to tell you about what's happening in Quebec. So I was very pleased to see that my colleagues from parents' associations did that very well. And so what I wanted to do was to come up with a new theoretical formulation in an ecosystem-based perspective to try to understand the stakes at all levels. And in that case, I will use my clinical experience. And I wanted to tell you about what I call the trans jihad. I'm saying this literally with a lot of respect for my religious friends, with a lot of empathy for the true suffering of these young people, respect for their attempts at agency and their desire to do something. But I would like to tell you an anthropological point of view of the situation in Quebec, which I think will enable us to position this discussion in a more broader framework. Because what's interesting in Quebec is that we have sociocultural specificities which I think shed a different light on a potential origin for this trans phenomenon. Contrary to preconceived ideas, and I hope that I'm not going to shock my colleagues from Quebec, Quebec is not a bilingual province. Quebec is characterized by two solitudes, actually. You have two language communities which don't understand one another, which don't speak the same language, and which don't have the same institutions. And this is very relevant when it comes to education. And there is a third solitude, which is basically an assembly of micro-solitudes based on migrant communities who try to go into the English side of it, of the province. I'm saying this because historically the trans phenomenon in Quebec seems to have hit the Anglo part of the area first, ultra-liberal, well-off communities. I'm thinking about the population that Lisa Littman has described. I'm thinking also of recent surveys by Anglo-Canadian Eric Kaufman, politologist, who describes in this ultra-liberal Anglo-Saxon context that up to 33% of young people claim to be queer, to be part of the LGBTQ plus community. So that was back in 2021. I had a conversation with a colleague who teaches in California last week, and he said, oh yes, of course, in some of my classes, I have 75% of my pupils who claim to be queer or non-binary. So in Quebec, what I think I have noticed since 2015, I teach at McGill, and I did not see this in the French-speaking communities. So the first communities to be impacted was the English-speaking communities, and there seems to have been some kind of resistance in larger cities, larger French-speaking cities, because actually this trans movement was seen as something being imposed by the Anglo side. So, as I said, in some micro-niches of the French-speaking elite, they tended to oppose this, And also, there's been a very, very efficient lobbying of the activists, English-speaking first and then French-speaking, in schools, in universities, and in the social services. So what we see in Quebec now, I think, could be generalized to the West as a whole, and we see that in terms of sensitivity to this thing, you have two poles, actually. And I would like to stress that when you speak to parents or parents' associations, well, they might feel stigmatized if you talk about risk factors in families. But of course, we're not trying to blame them. We're trying to understand the traumatic distress pathways of these kids. When you talk about epidemiological lines, you never point your finger at specific situations. But basically, the two poles, the two clusters here, which I've come up with, confirmed by epidemiological studies, is the first one is bourgeois, liberal, urban families, positive education, organic food, etc. And king children, you're thinking private schools where your little girls declare that they're transsexual when they're 10, non-binary at 12, at 14 they're trans, and when they come 16 they want to have a mastectomy reimbursed by the Social Security. So it's the first pole. And the second pole, which is at the complete opposite, is very, very low-income families, young people who've been placed in foster families or in institutions, and their only attachment figure was psychosocial workers, like, foster family or family planning or whatever. Very often they don't have, people who don't have kids, who work as foster families and who have this little kind of guilt of not having children, and therefore they take kids in their families. And I will get back to this in a moment. My colleagues in Quebec talked about the key things that happened in Quebec recently, and I'm not going to go into the details, but it's important to know that we have the supervisory board made of experts in order to assess the impact of all these things on society, in order to review the scientific evidence that exists. But it's been very badly perceived, and we had this this documentary Trans Express broadcast by Radio-Canada, which is supposed to be woke. It's the state radio, right? And things are starting to change in an interesting way in Quebec. Now, after the documentary on Radio-Canada, what I noticed in the university hallways and in the clinicians' meetings is that actually people felt more free to speak. It's as if people allowed themselves to speak at last and to ask questions. But in the activist environment, in the activist spheres, there were very strong reactions. There was a manifesto signed by 100 of associations, including the Federation of Women, who are activists who also vandalized the offices of Radio-Canada. They really called for trans rage. They said that Radio-Canada journalists were actually child killers and that they had blood on their hands. And I just have a few minutes left, but I would like to clarify what I think we should call a terrorist escalation. And of course, I'm very cautious in my choice of words. I have some practice in clinical research in the area. But what I want to describe is a context in which ideologists are willing to make personal sacrifices, violent actions, and to create psychological terror and the fear of repression in the name of a cause which they consider to be noble. So we have this clash between the good and the bad, the pure and the impure, and this generates new forms of taboo and sacred notions. And this is where I go back to the woke and trans religiosity, which has been mentioned by Jean-François Bronstein. Thank you, Jean-François. Your book is absolutely great. Now, I don't want to suggest that there is a causal relationship between religion and terrorism, of course. There are a certain number of very good studies which show that religiousness, especially growing up in a religious family, is a protective factor against against violent extremism, having access to a community, social fabric, to some stability, to rights, etc. This is very good. Religion and religiousness becomes a risk factor in the case there is a conversion, a quick transformation of your landmarks, which will lead you to clash from your family and from your social environment. I don't want to go into the details here, but I want to say that when you look at the families where young people, for example, will convert to radical Islam and go to Syria or become neo-Nazis, and the families where young girls become trans, well, it's the same spectrum of vulnerabilities in the family structures, which has been identified. This concept of jihad seems very relevant to talk about the trans culture. It's the most extreme, the most Salafist version of woke. Actually, jihad is a personal sacrifice made in the name of God, God being a moral, transcending ontological reality. In the extremist Salafist version, the jihad also has to be offensive. You have to convert the miscreants. You have to also punish those who have renounced their religion, and you have to impose the Sharia, which is the only true and possible law. The historical rise in woke, the great awakening, was very often compared theologically to the Great Awakening, which describes the theological transformations of Protestantism in the US in the 19th century, where you had some kind of very millenaristic, apocalyptic groups that came out, but based on the revelation, that is a non-mediated individual connection to a transcending religious authority. I think that the jihadi Salafism is even more modern and gives us a better comparison. I'm sure you know that one of the brilliant theological innovations of Daesh, Islamic State, was the liberalization of theology and case law, because it enabled young people, very often converted young people, to identify those who were the bad believers who had renounced their religion and who could be punished, the apostates. You know, it's called takfir, and there is a parallel between the takfir and the woke police. It's the same paradox, actually, social hyperconformism that makes you a member of a community by a symbolic and real community where the only source of authority is your individual feelings. The good news is that these projects usually are not manageable. You know, in Islamic State, you had chains of takfirs where everybody would excommunicate everybody else, and so it was not manageable anymore. They had to execute whole battalions, and so it was not manageable after a while because there was nobody left. And it's the same thing in woke. And this is good news for us overall. So, to wrap up, if sincere Islamic and woke ideologists are quite few, once again, because they come from a very damaged family structure where young people, well, you know, we should be concerned that our societies look more and more like a very damaged family structure. I'm talking of a framework where young people cannot develop a secure attachment connection to a parent figure, to a scientific figure who is reassuring. It's not about power, it's about reassurance. This is no longer offered to young people. So the jihadi Salafism is very modern. Seen in the pan-Arabic contest of the post-colonial world in the 50s, people did not identify themselves with the institutions anymore, which they considered to be amoral and corrupt. And so this is my conclusion. Rather than continuing to capitulate to the alienating wokeism in schools and hospitals, it's time to reconquer our institutions before it's too late. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you so much, Samuel. I just wanted to point out something in your speech. You talked about attachment patterns and pléthore ou carence. These are phenomena that we think we need to study on a clinical point of view, underlining the question of transidentification in minors and the question of cleavage also. So
Splitting.
Cleavage. So